outside Leningrad, where it was thought he would be safely out of the way of the Germans. Moscow's danger had distracted attention from Leningrad, the fall of which Hitler considered more important than the capture of the capital. Destroy Leningrad and Stalingrad, the breeding grounds of Bolshevism, he said, and the Russian resistance would collapse. Accordingly, General Wilhelm von Lieb's army with Army Group North, after 2 months of swift, destructive blitzkrieg, stood outside the city in August 1941, ready for the final blow. Then Hitler changed his mind. Leningrad was to be encircled and starved into submission. So the siege began, 900 days of slow starvation, more than 1 million dead and a ghost city caught unprepared. A terrible story of corpses, cannibalism, and political maneuvering never fully revealed until the 1960s, and perhaps further since. At the time, no one outside Leningrad knew about the situation, because the communiques on the Western correspondents received in Moscow were dry, matter-of-fact, and without description. Germans read in their newspapers in mid-September that all fortification lines around Leningrad had been pierced, but at the same time it was admitted that the defenses were amazingly strong and progress was slow. Then correspondents in Berlin were told that Leningrad was now strategically unimportant, and then nothing more was said. Again, it was Malaparte and Corriere della Sera who foresaw what was going to happen and succeeded in getting his story into the newspaper. On September 27th, he wrote, quote, "Every one of Leningrad's 100,000 houses has been converted into a fort. The Germans will have to overcome fierce resistance in each one. Russian warships take part in fighting the German artillery. Every day, fresh Soviet tank squadrons launch counterattacks from dawn to dusk. The countryside is a nursery of mines. Mines are placed everywhere, in isolated houses, public buildings, and private dwellings. They are in sofas, telephones, drawers, under carpets. They explode when the light is switched on. 3 weeks of fighting around the city has only been the beginning." End quote. In his earlier reports from the Ukraine, Malaparte had described finding a map of Leningrad with all the tactical positions of the October Revolution marked on it. In October 1942, from the Finnish lines 10 miles outside the city, he wrote, quote, "That map could be used today to indicate the fundamental elements of the defense of Leningrad. The physiognomy of the city's defenses is more political than military. The exceptional importance of Leningrad as the capital of the October Revolution and citadel of the communist extremism imposes on this special political and social character on its defense." End quote. Leningrad was saved by Ladoga lifelines, convoys of food taken across Lake Ladoga by boat in the summer and over the ice in the winter, but the line did not function effectively until February 1942, when the winter famine had already caused immense suffering. Malaparte, working on a novel Kaput, a vast fresco of Europe in ruins, went out on the lake in the spring thaw of 1942, started and sent an emotional story to Corriere della Sera about the cost of opening the lifeline to Leningrad. He had been walking over the ice, looking down into the lake as though through a window. Quote, "Under my shoes, imprinted in the ice as transparent crystal, was a line of beautiful human faces, a line of glass masks like a Byzantine icon. They were looking at me, staring at me. The lips were narrow and worn, the hair long, the noses sharp, the eyes large and very clear. They were the images of Soviet soldiers who had fallen in the attempt to cross the lake. Their poor bodies, imprisoned all winter by the ice, had been swept away by the first spring currents, but their faces remained printed in the pure green-blue crystal. They watched me serenely, and it even seemed as if they tried to follow me with their eyes." End quote. The Russians allowed 2 Western correspondents to visit Leningrad during the siege, Henry Shapiro and Alexander Worth. Shapiro went in September 1943 and Worth a few weeks later. Worth wrote, "Only the fittest have survived, the weaker have died or gone away. But among the fittest citizens of Leningrad are the many thousands of children who continue to live there." The German ring around the city was finally broken in January 1944, and the Russians flew in the Western correspondents from Moscow. But even then, the lack of time, censorship, and pressure of other events, and a Russian unwillingness to give the siege too much prominence, this attitude reached a climax after the war, when Stalin eliminated Leningrad's personality called by, quote, eliminating, end quote, its defense leaders, meaning that little of the real story emerged. Harrison E. Salisbury, there for the United Press late in January, wrote in 1962, "This was the greatest and longest siege endured by a modern city, a time of trial, suffering, and heroism that reached peaks of tragedy and bravery almost beyond our power to comprehend. Even in the Soviet Union, the epic of Leningrad received only modest attention compared with that devoted to Stalingrad and the Battle of Moscow. And in the West, not 1 person in 50 is thrilled. The courage of the Londoners in battle, Britain is consignment of that of the Leningradners." So, in 1969, Salisbury proved his point by writing The Siege of Leningrad, a 600-page account embracing 300 to 400 individual Russian personal experiences. The book was an immediate bestseller, and for the first time, a quarter of a century after the event, the full story of what happened in Leningrad during the war finally emerged. During the period of war, when the Russian fortunes were at a low point, the anti-German outpourings of Ilya Ehrenberg reached a peak. He began to write about 2-legged animals who have mastered the technique of war, ersatz-men, who in outward appearance reminded me of a civilized European, but who in actual fact would offend the morals of an inhabitant of the Sandwich Islands. Alexander Worth saw this later as near racialist, but he was in no position to criticize Ehrenberg at the time, because Worth himself had written in the Sunday Times of the fanaticism, bestiality, and lack of normal human reflexes of the German soldier, and had described 2 German airmen he had seen as, quote, disgusting pieces of inhumanity, end quote. Ed Stevens, then the Christian Science Monitor's correspondent who knew Ehrenberg, has said, "Being Jewish, Ehrenberg felt very strongly about Nazis and tended to stress their atrocities, and was reluctant to distinguish between good and bad Germans, and thus he deviated from the party line. But deviation from the party line over a long period was not possible, and so the only conclusion one can reach is that the Soviet authorities, while officially taking the line that the fascists and not the German people were responsible for the war, felt that a little emotional anti-German propaganda at a time when the Russian fortunes were at a low ebb could only help the situation." At least Western war correspondents had been allowed into Leningrad during the siege. At Stalingrad, there were only Russians and German correspondents. The Germans brought a party of Japanese, Spanish, Italian, French, and Romanian war correspondents to the rear of the Germans' lines, ready to cover the fall of the city. But in early October 1942, After having waited for nearly a month and with Stalingrad holding firm, they took them back to Berlin. Some Russians were in Stalingrad off and on. Konstantin Simonov and Olender of Red Star and Rosovsky of Izvestia. But one, Vasily Grossman of Red Star, was there throughout the entire battle. Grossman's literary style tended to be flowery, and his dispatches of little use to Western correspondents hungry for facts. Our soldiers have conquered the sun, they have conquered the daylight, they have conquered the right to walk erect over Stalingrad soil, Grossman wrote. The Germans are now hiding among the stone ruins, and there is no sun for them. Their food ration is 100 grams of bread and little horse flesh. They are like savages overgrown with wool. They sit in their stone caves gnawing at savages overgrown with wool. They sit in their stone gnawing at horse's bone. Down there in the muddy darkness among the ruins of a beautiful city they have destroyed, among the dead workshops that were once the pride of our Soviet country, here among the dark, cold ruins with no water and only scraps of horse flesh to eat, they will meet with vengeance. They will meet with it under the cruel stars of the Russian winter night. Simonov, who later wrote a best-selling novel about Stalingrad, at the time concentrated on analytical reports for Red Star, and these formed the basis of dispatches most Western correspondents sent on the battle. German correspondents' reports made up in frankness what they lacked in facts and description. Quote, the ranks are thinning, end quote, one correspondent wrote in mid-September. Quote, fighting goes on by day and night. Death has ceased to appall the German soldier on the Russian front. He now regards it as his inescapable fate, end quote. All the German correspondents wrote of the effectiveness of Russian artillery firing from the left bank of the Volga and from the center of Stalingrad. One said that doctors at field hospitals were so busy that they often collapsed from sheer fatigue. But the best straight descriptions of the hell of Stalingrad appeared not in contemporary reporting from either side, but in the diaries of ordinary soldiers. A German private noted on September 16th, the grain in the elevator is burning. The Russians seem to have set a light to it themselves. Barbarism. The battalion is suffering heavy losses. There are not more than 60 men left in each company. The elevator is occupied not by men, but by devils that no flames or bullets can destroy. End quote. And on September 18th, quote, fighting is going on inside the elevator. If all the buildings of Stalingrad are defeated like this, then none of our soldiers will get back to Germany. End quote. The Russians did defend each building like this. In foundries, factories, houses, and shops, the Germans found themselves fighting for each yard of territory. Quote, we have fought 15 days for a single house, end quote, a German lieutenant wrote in October. Quote, already the third day, 54 German corpses were strewn in the cellars, on the landings and the staircases. Ask any soldier what half an hour of hand-to-hand struggle means. Then imagine Stalingrad. 80 days and 80 nights of hand-to-hand struggles. Animals flee this hell. The hardest stones cannot bear it for long. Only men endure. End quote. The Germans endured, but they spent the flower of the Wehrmacht in the attack, and now, battered and exhausted, they could only try to stay alive. A further major offensive was out of the question. The Russians completed their encirclement of Stalingrad and waited for the Germans to grow weak. Throughout December and early January, conditions became deplorable. Quote, only 20 to 30 cartridges a day were distributed with the order to use them solely to repulse an attack, one German soldier wrote. The ration of bread was reduced to a slice. Water came from melted snow. A kilogram box of potatoes had to make do for 15 men. There was no meat. We ate our horses at Christmas. Sensing that Stalingrad had contained this sort of story, the Western correspondents did their best to get there. A party of 11, including Alexander Worth and Henry Shapiro, was taken on a conducted tour of the area. The closest they were allowed to Stalingrad itself was some 60 miles away, but even to have been near Stalingrad was news. The City Dispatch, one of the Kemsley group which Worth worked with, described his story as, quote, one of the most graphic dispatches of the war, end quote, and splashed it with the headline, I toured the Stalingrad battle area. Yet Worth wrote, it is not possible to visit Stalingrad itself, but here we are near it. We hear some miles south of the city the guns of Stalingrad. At nightfall, we crossed the pontoon bridge over the frozen Volga, and in the night, in the northern, there were a faint halo of light. This might appear rather thin material to become excited about, but it was an improvement on what the correspondents had been sending earlier. Back in September, Worth had been reduced to writing, Moscow, Sunday. I have just seen a man who was in Stalingrad on Friday. The spirit of the Russian troops is most inspiring thing I have ever seen, he told me. And Ralph Parker sent a whole column to the Times and the New York Times in mid-October that was a verbatim quotation from Pravda correspondent's dispatch. Even the run-up to the Russian victory did not get the coverage it should have. On January 8th, the Russians delivered an ultimatum to General Friedrich von Paulus, commander of the German 6th Army in Stalingrad, calling on him to surrender, but the last text of the document was made public. Only after it was no longer interesting as news. The actual surrender on February 2nd was reported round the world. The Russian newspapers published photographs of von Paulus signing terms of surrender and of the 90,000 German prisoners winding their way like black serpents across the ice-covered Volga. Germany made no attempt to minimize the disaster. Newspapers published the special communique from Hitler's headquarters announcing the end of the 6th Army. 4 days of mourning were decreed, and the radio played Uhland's moving soldier's song, Ich hat einen Kameraden, at frequent intervals. The idea seems to have been to tell the truth about the loss of the 6th Army, but to emphasize the line, their sacrifice has not been in vain. On February 4th, the Russians at last took 20 foreign war correspondents, the largest party allowed anywhere since the start of the war, to Stalingrad. Outside the city, they were first shown the 8 German generals who had surrendered. Hitler had made von Paulus a field marshal just before the fall of Stalingrad, and were allowed to conduct a rather strange interview with them. The correspondents were told that it would be up to each general to decide whether he wanted to answer questions. In any case, no correspondent would be allowed to enter a general's room, but would have to speak with him from the corridor through the open door. The stories the correspondents wrote were, quite correctly, lost in the pressure of harder news, but Worth's exchange with the arrogant Dietlof von Arnim is worth recalling. Worth, mindful of reports of German atrocities in occupied Soviet territory and the treatment of Russian prisoners, 2 million died in camps, asked von Arnim how the Russians were treating him. The officers are correct, von Arnim said, but the officers are impudent thieving swine. I've had 4 suitcases and they stole them all. In Stalingrad itself, the correspondents were able to get an idea of the story they had missed. Worth wrote, "At the far end of a yard I caught sight of a human figure. He had been crouching over a cesspool and now, noticing us, was hastily pulling up his pants, and then he slunk away into the door of a basement. But as he passed, I caught a glimpse of the wretch's face, with its mixture of suffering and idiot-like incomprehension. For a moment I wished the whole Germany were there to see it. The man was perhaps already dying. In that basement into which he slunk into, there were still 200 Germans, dying of hunger and frostbite. We haven't had time to deal with them yet," one of the Russians said. "They'll be taken away tomorrow, I suppose." At the end of the yard, behind a low stone wall, the yellow corpses of skinny Germans were piled up, men who had died in that basement, about a dozen wax-like dummies. I remembered the long, anxious days of 1942, the nights of the London Blitz, the photographs of Hitler smirking as he stood on the steps of the Madeleine in Paris, and the weary days of 38 and 39 when a jittery Europe would tune in to Berlin and hear Hitler's yells, accompanied by the roar of the German mob. And there seemed a rough but divine justice in those frozen cesspools with their diarrhea, and those horses' bones, and those starved yellow corpses in the yard of the Red Army's house at Stalingrad. Was Stalingrad the turning point of the war? It has a greater claim to the sideshow at Alamein, a fact sensed, rather recognized, in the lavish celebrations for Stalingrad's 25th anniversary of its renaming that went all over Britain soon after the Russian victory. The Russian ambassador reported, however, that already some sections of the British public were worried that the Russians would now be able to reach Berlin first. But there was another battle that deserves the title. This is the Battle of Kursk, sandwiched in time scale between Stalingrad and the Allied invasion of Sicily. This massive struggle, the real military turning point of the war, went unreported and unrealized in the West, and even today is little known. A head-on clash between two mechanized armies, with some 6,000 tanks and 4,000 planes involved. The Battle of Kursk was fought in 6 days over a narrow front, a tiny area of concentrated carnage that was left littered with burnt-out tanks, wrecked planes, and thousands of German and Russian corpses. Kursk was a direct trial of strength between the new German tanks, the Tigers and the Panthers, and the Russian T-34s, a colossal battle of attrition in the First World War style, in which firepower and military morale, rather than leadership, were the crucial factors. It was vital for the Germans to win, not only for political reasons. Hitler desperately needed a victory to counter the Russian successes at Stalingrad, but for military ones as well. And if this enormous concentration of German military might not break the Russians, nothing would. On July 5th, 1943, the greatest armored battle in the history of warfare began at sunrise. The first news of fighting came from Moscow, where the communiqué that evening, flat and unemotional though it was, contained the startling sentence, "Preliminary reports show that our troops have crippled or destroyed 568 tanks. 203 enemy planes have been shot down." There had never been anything like this level of success in one day. The final battle, on July 12th, an 8-hour head-on collision between the remaining 600 German tanks and the Soviet Fifth Army. It ended in a Russian victory. The German losses were put at 70,000 men, 2,000 tanks, 1,392 planes. and 500,000 motor vehicles. The Russians have never revealed their losses, but they too must have been enormous. A German PK cameraman took some remarkable shots of the battle, but he was captured, and the Russians did not release his film until 1972, when it appeared for the first time in the West in a British television documentary. In this huge battle, remarkable examples of courage and fortitude occurred on both sides, but it was the fate of such stories to be lost until after the war, because the Russians were too busy celebrating with victory salvos what they now knew to be the beginning of the end, and because, in the West, Stalingrad, though still fresh in the mind, gave way to news of the Allied invasion of Sicily. Kursk, in between the two, went unreported. There were other events of note on the Eastern Front that went unreported. One of the strangest events concerned the fate of the first big shuttle raid by flying fortresses of the United States Air Force in June 1944. The idea was that the giant bombers would fly over Germany from bases in Italy, drop their bombs on Hungarian and Romanian targets, land at bases the Americans had established in Ukraine, and then fly back to Italy, dropping more bombs on the way. The Russians did not like this. They did not like the idea of American bases on Russian soil, and they were reluctant to allow Ukrainians in the war-devastated areas around the bases to mix with American servicemen with their high standard of living. The principal base was at Poltava. To witness the beginning of this example of Soviet-American solidarity, the foreign correspondents in Moscow were taken on a tour of the base to the first fortresses. 70 of them fly in. A German spotter plane had trailed the bombers to the base, but inexplicably, the Russians made no attempt to provide adequate anti-aircraft or fighter cover. So, in a surprise night raid, the Germans succeeded in killing 2 Americans and 30 Russians. The Russians were embarrassed at having failed to protect the base properly, and were relieved when the United States censors agreed that no news of the German raid should be released. Ed Stevens, who had been at Poltava, had left to return to Moscow before the raid, says he managed to write something about it some months later, but the American war commentator Fletcher Pratt claims that it was not until 1945, when W. L. White told the story in Report on the Russians, that American readers learned of the extent of the disaster. The recapture of Sevastopol in 1944 was reported as a German Dunkirk. Chap, the Germans surrendered or were blown to pieces, losing between 60,000 and 100,000 men. At first, the German figure, the second the rush. Foreign war correspondents were allowed to make a brief tour of the liberated city. You couldn't walk more than a yard or two in any direction without stepping on a body, wrote Harrison Salisbury. The city itself is in rubble. It's a 90-minute drive through the streets. I only saw 5 buildings which appeared to be habitable. The mayor estimated that 10,000 civilians remained from pre-war population of 100,000. I saw only 30. But the real story at Sevastopol was how the Soviet authorities treated collaborators. The Crimean Tartars had welcomed the arrival of the Germans. They had hunted down Russian soldiers in disguise, had formed a police force under the German control, and had been active in the Gestapo. It supplied the Wehrmacht with soldiers. Now the moment of reckoning had arrived. The whole Crimean Tartar community of something between 300,000 and 500,000 men, women, and children was rounded up and sent into exile in Central Asia and they have never been allowed to return. This episode raises the whole question of collaboration with Germans by other Soviet communities, a story never reported at the time, for obvious reasons, and even now a highly sensitive issue in Russia. For the fact is that, had Hitler not been so intent on implementing his racist policies in the conquered eastern territories, he might have won the support of Ukrainians and non-Slav peoples of the Soviet Union and have turned them all against Stalin. If this had happened, then the outcome of the war might have been different. As it was, some 800,000 members of these and other nationalities, all citizens of the USSR, served with the German forces. Opposition to Stalin in parts of the Soviet Union was so strong that the Red Army prisoners and civilians in German-occupied areas began helping the Wehrmacht in menial tasks. This presently extended to the bearing of arms against their former comrades, and before long there was hardly a German unit in the forward area that did not have a number of Russian troops in German uniform on its strength. The Germans used Cossacks to hunt Tito's partisans in Yugoslavia, Ukrainians to man pillboxes along the Atlantic Wall, and Russians to help suppress anti-fascist movements in Italy. And early in 1945, they accepted a scheme put forward by a captured Russian general, Andrei Andreevich Vlasov, for the recruitment of a Russian Liberation Army of two divisions under the command of Vlasov himself to fight on the Eastern Front. This army was defeated and its soldiers either captured by the Red Army or taken by British or American troops who handed them over to the Russians. In 1946, Vlasov was hanged in Moscow, many thousands of his men having already been shot. It is understandable, perhaps, that foreign war correspondents who learned of Soviet citizens serving Hitler decided, in the interest of the Allied cause, not to write the story. But it is less easy to explain why one American, Quentin Reynolds, went out of his way to state that there were no collaborators in Russia. In his book, Only the Stars Are Neutral, written after 10 weeks in Russia in 1941, Reynolds said, "Today there is not one fifth columnist, not one quisling at liberty in Soviet Russia. The Germans tried desperately to set up local tribunals with local citizens as nominal heads of tribunals when they captured cities like Odessa, Kiev, and others which fell to them during their successful march through South last autumn. But in no case were they successful. Potential quislings were all in the work camps of the far north. Stalin knew what he was doing back in 1938. Russia's magnificent unity today and her completely unbroken spirit after the dreadful tragedy of that German advance is proof of the fact that Russia accepted the purge and proved of Stalin's 'you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs' policy." Finally, the story of Katyn Forest massacre illustrates the extreme difficulty that foreign war correspondents experienced in working in the Soviet Union during the war. On January 15, 1944, a large group of Western correspondents, including Worth and Stevens, accompanied by Kathy Harriman, daughter of the American ambassador Averil Harriman, was taken to look at hundreds of bodies and Polish uniforms that had been dug up at Katyn Forest by Russians. It was said that 10,000 were buried there. The aim of the official investigation by the Russians was ostensibly to establish whether the Poles had been shot when prisoners of the Russians in the spring of 1940 or when prisoners of the Germans in the summer of autumn 1941. The correspondents went with the hope of being able to send stories announcing that the truth had been established, or at least to present their own conclusions on the evidence before them. Instead, they were placed in an impossible position. They were allowed to attend only one session of the inquiry. They were not allowed to interview any of the witnesses, and they were prevented from writing any comment or weighing or assessing the evidence in any way at all. Even implied criticism of the way the Russians had conducted the inquiry was censored from their reports. Since the Katyn Forest massacre was not news in itself, the Germans had revealed the existence of the mass graves in April 1943 and had blamed the Russians. All that a Western reader got from the correspondence now was the official Russian version, that the Germans were killers, and although many correspondents felt that the evidence supporting the Russians' version was not very impressive, it is by no means certain that they would have written this even if they had been at liberty to do so. To suggest that the Russian case was as bad as Gable's case is even worse, Worth wrote later. It's something one couldn't do in wartime. It was imperative not to play into the Germans' hands. With the Germans on the run, it was inevitable, and the war correspondents with the PK, 12,000 strong, at the height of the Russian campaign, had to take on a new role. Many had lost the confidence of German readers through their optimistic reports of progress on the Eastern Front. Stalingrad now brought to a head long smoldering enmity between propaganda ministry and the Wehrmacht High Command. The operative correspondents, often former reserve officers, resented that they called the rah-rah reporting of the ardent Nazi PK men. After the Stalingrad defeat, Goebbels market-tested each correspondent's reader following. He must have been alarmed to find that the operative correspondents, mostly journalists of the pre-Nazi era, were both more widely read and considered by their readers to be more trustworthy. So the more influential of these were moved from the Eastern Front, some to France, some to Italy, leaving the Nazi PK men facing the Russians free to France, some to Italy, leaving the Nazi PK men facing the Russians free to concentrate on their new role. No longer would they be writing about victories. Their task now would be to play down the retreats, minimize losses, and steel the German nation for bitter resistance. On the Russian side, the tide of war having turned, one would have expected changes. Now, surely the Soviet authorities would allow Western correspondents to cover the successes of the Red Army. They did not. The Russian authorities remained as suspicious of Western correspondents during the storming of Berlin in 1945 as they had been in the first days of the war. Given this and other difficulties of working in the Soviet Union, it's not surprising that the war in Russia was so poorly covered and produced so few worthwhile correspondents. Malcolm Muggeridge, who was a correspondent in Moscow after the war, summed up the difficulties. Strongly partisan feelings, one way or the other, are mostly unavoidable. The pressure of the regime's own propaganda is so strong you either largely succumb to it or feel constrained to adopt a position of dedicated opposition. Worth succumbed, but his reporting carried a depth the others lacked, and his massive book, Russia at War, published in 1964, included all the material he had not written or had not been allowed to write for the war years. He was frank about his pro-Russian sentiments, and some of his anger against the Cold War warriors in the West is understandable. Just before he died, in Paris 1969, he revealed why he had resigned from the Sunday Times when his professional status was at its peak. On his return to London in October 1945, Lord Kemsley, the paper's proprietor, asked him to dinner. Worth was expressing his admiration for the Russian war effort when another guest, the Minister of Supply, Sir Andrew Duncan, suddenly said, "The only solution is to drop an atom bomb on Moscow." Worth agreed later, it was not the Lord Kemsley's fault that some of his friends cherished such monstrous ideas, but he resigned anyway. Ralph Parker succumbed, despite having his early wartime work for the British government. The keenness with which he described the Russian struggle attracted the attention of Soviet authorities, and he decided that his future was in Russia rather than in the West. The New York Times had dropped him in 1943 for Soviet bias, and had replaced him with Bill Lawrence, and in 1947 the Times, too, asked for his resignation. Thereafter he worked as a freelance for a number of newspapers, including the American and British Daily Worker. At the height of the Cold War, he published a pamphlet accusing British diplomats of spying, an allegation that no doubt contained some degree of truth. In his latter years, he translated Alexander Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, and represented Solhurak, the New York theatrical entrepreneur, in Russia. He died in 1964. Ed Stevens left the Soviet Union in July 1944, went back from 46 to 49, spent 6 years in the 50s as Mediterranean Bureau Chief, based in Rome, for the Christian Science Monitor, then returned to Moscow, where, at the time of writing, he represents, among other papers, the Times and the Sunday Times of London and Newsday of Long Island. Henry Shapiro stayed on until 1973, when, after 40 years of reporting the Russian scene, he went back to the United States. His final opinion on working in Russia was, "Anyone who believes in advocacy journalism should not work here. If you take sides, become emotionally involved, you become a crusader. Look upon this place as a laboratory. Look on the negative and on the positive, but the minute a newsman takes sides, he stops being a reporter." Curzio Malaparte, the Italian correspondent, whose writing was ranked on Russia's best, died in 1957. Of the Russians, Ehrenberg died in 1967. Most of the other correspondents are still living as of 75, but Lazovsky, the Soviet spokesman who had been in control of the correspondence in the early part of the war, fell foul of Stalin and was shot in 1949. Thanks. If you enjoyed this chapter, please like and subscribe. And I upload pretty frequently, so I'll see you soon.